Well, welcome, everyone. It's really a pleasure to introduce our speaker today. This is a joint seminar series between the Natural Resource Ecology Lab, North Central Climate Science Center, and the Ecosystem Science and Sustainability Department. As you notice, I try to switch these around, so not giving any one department priority. So hopefully I've done that effectively over the semester. But this semester series has been really oriented toward how do we manage for climate change. Today we have Taryn Finnessey here with the state of Colorado, and she's really been a leader for the last almost 5 to 7 years, looking at sort of climate change issues and how do we look at it effectively across the various agencies within the state, working across various agencies that are interested in looking at how Colorado manages for climate change. She really has been effective, especially in looking at the issues within the Colorado Water Resource Board. And that's, I guess, partly her position is in that board as the climate change risk management specialist, which has been really being elevated within the governor's perspective over the last term and even within the prior term. She got her bachelor's degree in Earth and Environmental Sciences at West Wayland, and also her master's in Global Environmental Policy at American University. With that, we're looking forward to your perspective on what the state's doing. Thanks, Taryn.
I'm assuming you want me to stand here. Oh, I don't want to see myself. I'm going to stand here, but look this way.
Straight to the presentation.
All right. Well, thanks for having me here today to talk. I know you guys have had a whole host of folks over the semester, so hopefully I won't duplicate too much of what they said, but I may jog your memory on some of this. This is definitely a collaborative approach across not only state agencies, but also across federal agencies. We work a ton with the universities and try to leverage as much manpower as we can on this issue because we don't have a whole lot of resources at the state level. And so I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about, it's not there anymore.
Sorry.
Okay. I can go off memory, but not that well. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the state's doing and kind of our management approach for climate change. And as Dennis said, I have a kind of weird position. I'm housed within the Water Conservation Board, and 8 years ago I was hired solely to look at drought and climate change effects on water resources. And so the state has two water agencies, both of which are under the Division of Natural Resources, the Department of Natural Resources. One is the Division of the State Engineers, the Division of Water Resources, and then one is the Colorado Water Conservation Board. DWR is kind of the regulatory arm, and we are the policy arm. And so I'm housed within the Conservation Board. Over that 8 years, my position has continued to morph, and I'll go through kind of the chronology of how that has happened in just a second. But now I work across state agencies and actually spend most of my time working outside of the Conservation Board with other state agencies on how climate change impacts them and how we can kind of operationalize climate change through state efforts. And that certainly involves the governor's office quite a bit as well. Maybe. There we go. Success. So while CWCB has been working on climate change as it relates to water resources for about 9 years now, in 2013, we kind of stopped being the lone wolf. We were really the lead on climate change when it comes to climate change in Colorado at the state level, at the state agency level, because it's really easy to convince people about the connection between climate change and water resources. It gets a little bit more complex when you start going outside that realm. But in 2013, the legislature passed House Bill 13-1293, which did a couple of things. One, it required the state to develop a climate change plan, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It required more collaboration across state agencies, It required an annual report to the legislature, and it required that the governor's office appoint one person to coordinate these efforts across the state. And so that was really the kind of the beginning of when my position really started to go beyond climate change and water resources and look at climate change and other sectors. I'm just going to put that down. I talk with my hands enough anyway. So in 2015, after a pretty quick turnaround, it was about a 9-month, 10-month process, we released the Colorado Climate Change Plan. And this is building upon past efforts. The previous administration, Governor Ritter's administration, did release a climate plan that was very mitigation focused during his administration. It didn't really touch much on adaptation. There was a small part at the end on water where it talked about adaptation, but it wasn't super comprehensive. It didn't have, it was very agency focused but also prescriptive. So it set very broad overarching greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and laid out a couple programs and policies to reach those, but the numbers weren't really there to add up to those overall goals. So we kind of took a fundamentally different approach and said, well, we want to be more comprehensive. We want to look across state agencies. We want to look at what everyone's doing and what is the nexus of where we already have funding and resources and programs in place that we can build on those successes that actually result in real greenhouse gas emission reductions. And in the areas where we have less nexus with mitigation, how can we adapt? How can we start to look at responding to the changes we're already seeing in Colorado? And that's what this report is. It's not prescriptive. It really focuses on those state agency efforts, but it's also the very, very beginning of the conversation. And the governor made it very clear when we brought this to him that he wanted this to be the beginning of the dialogues. So we have spent much of the last year since it was released holding public engagement sessions and really having conversations with folks about how do we implement this in a meaningful way? How do we move the ball forward? And how do we position ourselves for a more resilient future? Now, all of this was built upon a scientific background, and this is the second edition of a report. The first was released in the fall of 2008. The second was released in 2014. The impetus for updating it was, one, there were things that we didn't really get to cover in the first report, and two, another round of projections and models, CMEP 5, came out to provide more information on CMEP 3. And I think it's really important to say that it's different information. It doesn't mean that the early international efforts were wrong or inaccurate. It's just different methods. And CMEP 5 kind of took a fundamentally different approach too. And so you kind of get a broader picture of what could happen. This looks specifically at Colorado. And while it was targeted for water resources initially in 2008, what we found is that it had much broader applicability than we thought. And so when we were writing it in 2014, we kept the title and everything the same, because then we can just call it a second edition and that's easy. But it also goes beyond that. So we have some language and some sections on forest health. We have some language and sections on public health. And so, we look beyond that. And when we've talked to people in Colorado, and we have done surveys and studies on kind of what does climate change mean to both the people and the agencies and the NGOs and the research universities, what's their biggest concern across the board? Water is their biggest concern. And it makes sense, right? We're a semi-arid state. And statewide, we get about 14 inches of precipitation a year. That's a third of what our eastern counterparts are getting. And so when we talk about possibly seeing either a reduction in precipitation or an increase in temperatures that increases evapotranspiration, that lack of water availability or decreased water availability is a big stressor, especially given that our population is rapidly rising. So the other study that the state commissioned, but actually Dennis was one of the leads on, along with Eric Gordon from the University of Colorado Boulder, he was within the RISA there, the Western Water Assessment, did a vulnerability study. It was a qualitative study, but again, it looked across sectors. So it was looking at, water, energy, public health, transportation, agriculture, ecosystems, I'm missing one, tourism. So looking across that at what are some of the areas we're vulnerable to climate change. And this is important to lay out on the table because I think conceptually we all know that, wow, people come to Colorado in the winter to ski. How is Colorado going to be impacted by climate change? And there's kind of pros and cons of this, right? And I get a lot of flack when I give talks because I talk about pros and cons and winners and losers in climate change. There's a lot of bad stuff and scary stuff with climate change. There's also a lot of winners and opportunities. And I think you have to look at both sides of the coin. So when it comes to tourism, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but when it comes to tourism, Colorado is situated at a relatively high elevation, highest average elevation in the nation. And our ski resorts are located at even higher elevations. So we are going to be, in the short term, relatively less impacted than, say, a ski resort like Alyeska in Alaska that's situated at sea level and is already seeing impacts as a result of climate change. Or East Coast ski resorts. So there's winners and losers and there's opportunities there. So why are we even doing this at the state level? There's so much going on internationally. There's so much going on at the national level. Why are we dedicating state resources to look at this? And this is looking at observed temperatures for Colorado, the US, and the globe as a whole. And it's a 10-year running mean. And what I really just want you to focus on is that across the globe, when you look at that line, it's relatively smoothed out. It gets a little bit more fluctuation in it when you look at just the US, and then you look at Colorado and there's increasingly more variability. And that variability is what makes management and planning really challenging, right? It's those swings from the extreme to the extreme. And so it's really important for us to look at this at a Colorado state level so that we know what is that possible range of extremes and how do we plan to make sure that we're able to adapt and deal with wherever we may be falling in the spectrum. So just to, hold on, I'm gonna tell this not to do whatever it's telling me to do. Okay, so just a refresher, I think, have Nolan or Jeff or someone talked about projections? Or not yet? Okay, great. So this is new. I love not being repetitive. So this is looking at, and this is again from our Colorado, Climate in Colorado report from 2014, observed and projected annual temperatures. So if you look back here, oh, I'll score. So if you look back here, this is going all the way back to 1950, kind of looking at what we've actually seen. Blue is below average, red is above average. And you can see how we've really trended towards higher temperatures. We've seen a 2-degree increase in temperature in Colorado over the last 30, 2.5 over the last 50. And then we take that out from our historical observed temperatures out to what some of the projections show. And you can tell these are all the different runs. We're all over the map, right? We're not gonna land on any one of these projections. This is not telling us where we're going. What projections are telling us is this is the range of plausible outcomes. And so this is from CMIP 5, we've got the RCP 8.5 and the RCP 4.5. These are kind of two different sets of projections going forward that depend on different things. This is kind of if we take some pretty strong action and reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally. This is if we kind of go along business as usual and don't really move forward. So there's a range in kind of where we could be. There's actually there's actually 4 sets within CMIP 5. There's one that is lower than this, and then one that I believe is in between these two. The lower than this, there's question as to whether or not we could even achieve that because it would take such significant action so quickly. And so these are the 2 that we focused on within the report. There is more data and information on our website if you wanted to drill into those other other sets. But so going forward, what do we expect? We look out to mid-century because that's kind of our planning horizon. And we would project to see an additional 2 to 6 degrees warming Fahrenheit by mid-century. Oh, look, it's working again. So what does that mean? 2 to 6 degrees. I mean, you can think, gosh, 2 to 6 degrees. Let's look at the weather that we saw this week, right? You know, it's going to be 50 one day and 80 another day, and 2 to 6 degrees. Are we even going to realize that? Are we going to even notice that? Well, we're talking annual temperature, right? So, so we're talking about kind of how this averages out over the entire year. So I want to help you contextualize that. What does 2 degrees warming mean? What does 4 degrees warming mean? Well, and I apologize, we only have this done for Denver, so I don't mean to be Denver-centric. It's just that that's the data we have available. Maybe you guys could shift it up slightly, but 2 degrees warming, Denver's seasonal temperature cycle would become more like Pueblo, so a pretty significant, noticeable shift. 4 degrees, Denver becomes more like Lamar. Lamar is located out in the eastern plains, southeastern plains of Colorado. And then 6 degrees, we don't actually have anything comparable within the state of Colorado. We'd have to go outside our state boundaries to New Mexico, where Denver seasonal temperatures would become more like Albuquerque. And so if you've been to Albuquerque, you could probably understand that that's a pretty noticeable difference in climatology. Albuquerque is a great place. Not sure that we really want to mimic their temperatures. So now I'm going to walk you through kind of the sectors, and we do take a sectoral approach to this, in part because it's easy to break down state agencies into sectors, and there's a lot of different approaches to looking at climate change. But what we're trying to do at the state level is kind of break down these silos, right? So you don't want to be just looking at climate change in one silo as like, what does climate change mean? You want climate change to be this thread that is woven throughout everything that state agencies are doing. That's how you operationalize climate change. It's how we look at population growth, right? Every single state agency in Colorado looks at population growth. They look at what it means to their own operations, to their own planning, to their own resources. Climate change is just another stressor that we need to look at in a similar vein. So I'm going to walk you through some of these. I'm not going to read off the vulnerabilities, but you can see here that some of them cross over sectors. So we see snowpack impacts. That obviously has ecosystem impacts. It also has tourism impacts. Water quality has public health. So really, even when we talk about water as a sector, we're still talking cross-sectorally. So when we look at the projected climate change impacts and how that affects the hydrology, what does it tell us? What do we know? Well, this is looking forward. So we already know that we're seeing increases in drought. That's already happening. We're already seeing some earlier snowmelt runoff. We've seen that. We can, based on just our observed data, we can say that that's happening. But when we look forward, what do we see? And how does that help us plan better and be more prepared? Well, annual stream flow, regardless of what happens with the temperature or with precipitation, and you should know that we have no idea what's going to happen with precipitation going forward. Colorado lies in this really unique place where to the south of us, the projections are pretty confident it's going to get drier. To the north of us, they're pretty confident it's going to get wetter. And where we are, they say, you know, the models don't really do a very good job projecting precipitation in areas that are geologically variable and that are mid-latitude landlocked states. And you're like, great, that's kind of the trifecta of what Colorado is. So we don't know. There are models that tell us that we're going to get wetter. There are models that tell us we're going to get drier. And there's really no clear signal in where we're going to go. So even if you just look at increase in precipitations where there is model agreement, all the models agree we're going to get warmer, we know that that is enough of a driver that it can impact annual stream flow. So we see a decrease in the majority of projections, and we've looked at this across the state. Some basins are impacted more heavily than others, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but across the state, most of the annual stream flow, we see a decrease. Peak runoff timing, across the board earlier in all projections. And this is separate of other stressors like dust on snow, where we're already seeing dust accumulate on our snowpack, which then causes higher solar radiation and melts off our snowpack anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks earlier. So you start looking at 2 to 4 weeks as a result of climate change, 2 to 4 weeks as a result of dust on snow. Like, that's a really big impact. The other thing to keep in mind is that water rights are allocated not just on use and volume, but water rights can also be allocated on time. So you are either in or out of priority based on when those streams are flowing. So if you think about this from an agricultural perspective, there could be stress because you may have the water right for the volume, but now the volume is occurring a month earlier and you need it, you know, when you've historically used it to feed your crops. So, so that's challenging. There's also some seasonal shifts with temperatures. So summers are projected to get warmer, more so than other seasons of the year. And so then that would again drive our evaporative demand within the agricultural sector, and you would need to apply more water to keep those crops alive. All right, where I was. Oh, look, I covered crop use already and I didn't even know it. That's great. April 1 snowpack is kind of the threshold for which we measure annual snowpack. We talk about April 1st. It's kind of when we right around where most basins hit their peak snowpack, but before they start melting off. Across the projections, we see a decrease in most areas. We're already seeing an increase in occurrence of drought, but we continue to see an increase in frequency and severity of drought across the state. Coupled with that, an increase in heat waves that has agricultural impacts, but it also has public health impacts. It also has energy demand impacts. Obviously, the inverse of that is less frequent cold waves and longer frost-free seasons. Now, going back to winners and losers, if you're in the Gunnison Basin where you have, you know, a 30 to 60-day frost-free season, a longer frost-free season might actually be a benefit. You can grow a whole larger range of, whoo, it is Friday morning and I can't even talk anymore. You can grow a whole lot more in a longer frost-free season than you can in a frost-free season that's 30 to 60 days. So that might actually be someone who benefits or wins. The catch is, yeah, you can grow more in a longer frost-free season if you have the water to do it. Wildfires, you know, you can't directly say that when you're in drought, you get more wildfires, drought causes wildfires, but you can say that the drier you are, the more stress you have on forests, and the more susceptible they are to wildfires. And so we definitely project more frequent and intense wildfires. And we've seen, you know, severe wildfires in the state in the last 10 to 15 years. And again, not only does it have an economic impact, but it has public health impact. It has a tourism impact. We saw a huge drop off in 2002 when we had the Hayman fire burning, and there were some very high level public officials that got up and said, the state is on fire. Not the thing you want to send to people who have booked their summer vacations in Colorado, even though, you know, large swaths of the state may be on fire. Colorado's a pretty big state, and if you're planning a vacation in Denver and the fire's in Durango, your vacation's probably not going to be impacted by that. But people outside the state of Colorado may not recognize that we're a very large state. So what does this mean? Where am I? Municipal. Okay, so what does this mean in the municipal level and the diversions that we would expect to see? This is looking at kind of the increase, and again, this is just looking at temperature. This low, medium, and high right here is looking at population growth and kind of how much we might see municipal diversions increase as a result of climate change. And it's not huge. It's 0 to 8%. A lot of that is driven by how much conservation are we putting in, what's our land use, right? You know, are we having sprawling ranchettes, or are we high density land use? So that is, that plays into it. But, you know, those decisions and those planning components are things that we need to start thinking about now, because 20 to 30 years from now, they're going to be impacted by climate change. And so how do we look to minimize this? How do we look to make this more on the 0 side than the 8 side? So that's looking at the municipal. And this is all included in part of the state water plan. And James Eklund would be very disappointed to me that I'm, 25 minutes in and I'm only just now mentioning the state water plan. But last year, the state water plan was released. It was called for by an executive order of the governor, and it really is charting out how do we meet Colorado's water demands now and into the future. And we explicitly chose to use climate change as a thread that runs throughout that water report. So it is not a standalone chapter. It is intertwined with the ecosystem. It's intertwined with watershed health. It's intertwined with supply and demand and agriculture and all of those different things. We embed climate change into it. And so these are some of the things that have been incorporated into that state water plan. This is going back to agriculture and how that shifts. And this is a really interesting slide because you can see that the average or the median looking of potential increase in consumptive use for crops is about 12%. So higher than we would, higher increase in demand or diversions expected from ag than municipal, which makes sense when you think it out. But at the same time, you look going forward, and you guys don't see years here because I clicked them accidentally, but I think we're looking at 2030 and 2050. Is that we don't know exactly what's going to happen with our agricultural lands, right? So there are a number of things that can happen. One, Colorado's growing really fast, and we're seeing conversion of our agriculture lands to more municipal lands. We're also seeing some buy and dry where it's becoming economically infeasible for farmers to grow crops on their land. And so they're selling their water rights to municipal and fallowing some of that land. And so there's going to be kind of changes in our land use across the state. And as we move forward, we need to think about, what kind of state are we? Agriculture is our, depending on how you break it out, second or third largest economic driver in the state of Colorado. That's huge. So are we going to grow more with less water and less land? That may be an option. Or are we going to move away from being kind of an agriculturally dominated state? These are big level policy discussions that we have now, and we have to be having now because the planning horizon for climate change is so long. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about stream flows and within our major river basins. And I want to talk about this because one of the things that we get pushback on is, well, climate change is happening and has been happening for eons, right? Like the climate changes. And how do we know that this is outside the realm of kind of what we've seen? And is it, or is it even outside the realm of what we've seen? So we've actually looked at the paleo reconstructions for a number of basins within the state of Colorado. You can see the South Platte, which is kind of the northeastern corner of the state, the Rio Grande down in the south central corner, the Arkansas, which is the southeast, and then the Colorado River, which is technically the entire west slope. And so I don't know if you can see it, although I will say that it shows better on this screen than probably any screen I've ever shown before. There's little yellow bars right here. And what these are showing are extreme droughts. And so they range in period. And remember, this is looking thousands of years. So we're outside our observed record. This is looking at the paleo reconstructions. We're seeing droughts that range from, maybe short 10 to 15 year drought to 20 or 30 year droughts, as high as 50-year drought periods. Now, about 10 or 15 years ago, Australia was in the midst of a 10-year drought. It crippled their entire water delivery system. It forced them to think about water and create partnerships and collaboration in a whole new way. And I would actually argue that they're way more resilient now than they were prior to that. But it forced those conversations because a 10-year drought stressed every single aspect of water use that they could even think about. You look back at our observed record, we don't have a 10 to 15 year drought in our observed record in Colorado. We have dry periods. They last 3 to 5 years, and then we get some wet periods. But a sustained long period of drought, we don't have. And we're not, a state that doesn't see drought. 9 out of every 10 years, some portion of the state experiences some level of drought. And so, so this is not new for us, and yet we are charting new territory. But there's also a lot to be learned from our paleo record. So if you don't feel comfortable going forward in the projections, you can still pull from the paleo record and get plenty of eye-opening news. Okay, so these are some of our strategies and recommendations going forward. This is pulled directly from our climate plan. Way more text than you should ever put on a PowerPoint. But basically what I'm saying here is if you're interested in it, go to our climate change report and you can read it. But really what it is that we have committed to work across sectors to try to address some of these challenges and move beyond just these conversations to really operationalizing how do we plan for this? How do we increase our resiliency? How do we move forward? I'm going to start speeding up because I know that I am way too verbose. Public health. I want to talk about public health and some of the impacts there. I've teed this up a little bit with wildfires, with water quality, vector-borne diseases, things like hantavirus, things like West Nile. These are all things that we've heard in the news over the last couple of years, but those can be related to climate change. Extreme weather events, again, floods, droughts, all things that we've experienced in the last couple of years. So this is an excerpt from our greenhouse gas inventory in the state of Colorado that looks at our emissions by sector. And you can see that down here, our electrical power sector is our largest source of emissions within the state of Colorado. And that is true pretty much kind of across the US. This is an area where there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. The Clean Power Plan was finalized by the Obama administration last fall, last summer, August of 2015. It's currently under a stay from the Supreme Court. But what it did is it used existing legislation, so the Clean Air Act, to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector. And it set standards or goals for each state to achieve and then left it up to the states as to how they achieve these goals. And so for Colorado, what that means is that it works out to be somewhere between a 31 and 38% reduction, depending on how you measure it. And EPA left it up to the state to figure out how you measure it. This has, like I said, has been stayed by the Supreme Court, and so we are kind of considered a pencils up state. So the governor has said, we still think that this is important, and we still think that we need to have conversations about this and figure out ways to move forward. So we're kind of in the process of figuring out how do we create a Colorado-specific approach. And part of the reason that we're doing this is because this is directly tied to our air quality. And the governor on numerous times has talked about how he really wants Colorado to have the highest air quality in the state. So how do we achieve that? And this is a really big piece of that. The other piece I want to talk about, and it's one of the things that gets forgotten all the time, is the materials management piece. This is has been called waste management. It includes recycling. But when you look at materials management, this is again from EPA, and it's taking a consumption-based approach to a greenhouse gas inventory. So our greenhouse gas inventory took a sector-based approach. This is a consumption-based. So it's kind of looking cradle to cradle at greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that about 39% of the emissions are coming from materials management, and really 13 of that is just from food. And one of the things that is continually coming up as kind of a source of greenhouse gas emission reductions is food waste. And how do we better manage our food waste? Because we put things in landfills, they decay, that creates methane. Methane is a more short-lived greenhouse gas than CO2, which is kind of the one we talk about the most, but it's also a stronger greenhouse gas. And so managing methane emissions is also very important. I should add there, and I think I talk about this later on, but in case I don't get to it, we were the first state in the nation to regulate methane emissions from oil and gas development, and EPA has actually used our framework for regulating that as the national, kind of part of the national framework. So the materials management is kind of a win-win, right? Like no one's anti-recycling. Composting, once you get the hang of it, really not that hard. How do we just kind of think about things in a different way? But it's something that we struggle with in Colorado because we have such rural communities, right? And so we don't necessarily have the facilities in some areas to recycle or to do municipal composting and things like that. So we're working with CDPHE to kind of figure out how can we get this in more prolific. So again, public health, lots of strategies and components included in our climate plan that you can go read. I'm going to talk about energy a little bit. Again, way too much text to be on a PowerPoint slide, but the message that I want to send here is that Colorado is one of the leaders with energy efficiency across the state. In the last 11 years, so since 2005, we have gone from 0.5% of renewable energy in the state to 15% renewable energy in the state. We have twice increased our renewable energy standard, which was the first voter-approved renewable energy standard in the nation. And so we have a ton of programs and measures in place to help increase renewable energy and energy efficiency within the state of Colorado. And we have continually recommitted to Colorado being an energy efficient state. It's attracted businesses. Vestas Wind built facilities here because they knew that this was a business-friendly state that supported renewable energy. Xcel Energy is on track to meet and exceed their renewable energy portfolio and has just committed to building a really large wind farm out in the Eastern Plains. We have the second largest biogas digester in the state of Colorado that is using those natural gases that happens from methane production through dairies and such to create energy. And that energy, before the digester was even built, was already bought by an energy company in California. So we really are on the leading edge with energy efficiency across the board in the state of Colorado, and we continue to it. This is, I just said this, energy, or Xcel Energy, which is Colorado's largest energy provider. It represents about 70% of the energy or the population. I'm not sure if it's population or energy consumption. 70% is in there someplace. But is on track to exceed their renewable energy goals by 2020. So they say projected 35% by 2020, but if you talk to them, they think they're gonna hit it earlier. And this is in part because not only was this mandated through a vote of the public, but it's also economically feasible. The economics of coal are very different now than they were 10 years ago. The economics of natural gas, which is much cleaner than coal, is very different now than it was 10 years ago. And the economics of renewable energy is very, very, very different. And a part of that is globalization and China's adoption of renewable energies. So again, here's some of our energy efficiency accomplishments. I'm not gonna read this. I'm just gonna put this up as a teaser that there's a whole lot of them. And again, working across sector, we work with energy efficiency in the dairies in Colorado and the ag community and trying to expand that. And I think, is ag next? No. Ag is important because they're price takers, not price makers. So they have to accept the commodity prices that exist so that they can reduce their bottom line through energy efficiency improvements, then they actually make more profit and can make more investments. Again, lots of strategies and policies that we're working on. Agriculture, I mentioned, you know, that they are price takers, not price makers. There are times, 2012, sky high commodity prices because most of the nation was in the midst of a really, really bad drought. But yields were awful because most of the nation was in a really bad drought, right? Basic supply and demand. The supply was down, the demand was high, the prices were high. right now, commodity prices are really, really, really low. Colorado is getting some of our best wheat and corn production and yields that we've seen in years, but producers just aren't making any money off of it because commodity prices are so low. So you add that, which is something that producers have always dealt with, to other stressors like decreased water availability, more pests, more weeds, and you start to drive up their production costs, and that profitability margin keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and you get to a point where it's really hard for producers to just stay in business. And then that brings up the question of, well, how do we, like, food security, right? We're increasing the global population, we're increasing the population of Colorado. How do we eat? And so those are some of the things that we grapple with. Heat stress, important not just for crops, but also for livestock. You know, cattle and sheep don't do well in really hot environments. So I want to talk a little bit about the nexus between water and agriculture and kind of how we manage for that. And so Colorado is unique in that portions of our state are very heavily irrigated and portions of our state rely on dry land agriculture. And your access or availability or water rights really are a big adaptive capacity to dealing with climate change. If you have really senior water rights in good volumes that are pretty flexible, you're going to be able to adapt to the other stresses as a result of climate change in a much different way than if you have really junior water rights that are out of priority in dry years, and you're growing some really water dependent crop. And so we wanted to look kind of basin-wide at the two different scenarios that the state uses for climate change. So the state relies on scenario planning for our long-term water planning, and of the 5 scenarios we look at, 3 of them have a perturbed climate, and they were loosely defined in a very qualitative manner as hot and dry, and then somewhere between 20th century observed and hot and dry. And we were left to define what that meant. We did define what it meant using all of the projections that I referenced earlier. And then we ran it through hydrology models to talk about kind of what does this mean from a water standpoint. And what you can see is that in the Rio Grande, the South Platte, and the Arkansas, which happen to be our 3 most heavily appropriated river basins, there is, under future conditions, defined as hot and dry, and somewhere between 20th century observed and hot and dry. And I will say these aren't super extreme scenarios. They're kind of like very plausible scenarios. These river basins do not have enough water to meet existing demand. And that's important because the assumption had always been that, yeah, we won't be able to meet future demands, but what we have going on right now will be fine. We'll be able to continue doing what we have right now. We just won't meet future demands. And what this shows is that actually that's not the case. And if you look at the Arkansas River, which is pretty heavily impacted, even in a single dry year, so 2012 was a dry year, not the worst on record, but a pretty dry year within the Arkansas Basin. Their calls on their water rights go back to 1865. So that means if you want to have a really secure water right within the Arkansas Basin, you better have established it prior to 1865. 1865 is a pretty darn old water right. Usually you're considered a senior water right if you're pre like 1920, 1918. Anything prior to that is considered a pretty senior water right that's pretty secure. But in the Arkansas Basin, you got to go 50 years earlier to have a really secure water right. And that really challenges kind of how operators and producers function within that area of the state. So transportation. How am I doing on time? Okay, good. I can do 5 minutes. Whew. Transportation. I love this sector. I have learned more about the transportation in the last 2 years than I ever knew before. And there's so much opportunity here. Why? Because transportation is really good at planning. They're constantly rebuilding and redoing things, and they are super susceptible to extreme events. Be it floods, be it droughts, be it rock falls. How is transportation susceptible to droughts, you may ask? Well, In 2012, when we had a really bad drought in southeastern Colorado, roads were being closed because they had such bad dust storms, like similar to the Dust Bowl era. I actually had 2 pictures in my office in 2013 of a Dust Bowl era picture and then a 2012 era picture. And the only difference, well, there were 2 differences. One was in black and white and one was in color. And the cars looked markedly different. But aside from that, they looked identical. And so roads are being closed. I mean, they had like multiple car accidents and pile-ups because cars literally could not see the cars in front of them as a result of these dust storms. So not only does that have huge transportation impacts, but again, going cross-sectorally, it has huge economic impacts, it has huge public health impacts, and we shouldn't underestimate the mental health impacts of that. I darn near lost my mind being out on the fields in the Eastern Plains in 2012 in these dust storms for one day. It wore on me, and I could leave and go home and take a shower that night. The people that live there have dust all throughout their house. It's in their teeth, it's in their food, and they can't escape it. And that's not creating an environment in which people think, this is a place I want to raise my kids. This is a community I want to invest in. And so that really does have very big economic impacts as well. The other fascinating thing about transportation, I don't know, I'll get to this a little bit more, maybe I'll flip ahead, is that when we think about economic development, one of the things we look at a lot is airports. And as your air density gets increases, so as your air gets hotter and more dense, planes can't carry as much, and it takes a longer runway to lift, and they can't carry as much cargo and weight. Now, this is something that Arizona already deals with in the summer, but not something that we typically deal with in Colorado. Now, it may not be an issue for DIA that has really, really long runways, but think about some of the other communities that have really short runways, like Durango or Telluride, or some of these areas that are small rural areas that are actually like geologically confined to their runway. I don't know if you've ever flown into Telluride, but it's like drops in, and you kind of have to stop by the end of the runway or you're going to go like down, and that would be bad. So those are challenges. But as I mentioned, transportation is constantly planning and looking at things, and they're constantly fixing infrastructure. And so this resiliency component is a huge opportunity. And so post the 2013 floods, CDOT has really started to look at how do we make a more resilient infrastructure system within the state of Colorado? How do we build better? And Highway 34 is a good example. They're moving it just a little bit. It's not a huge shift in kind of the pattern of where the road is, but they're moving it onto bedrock where it wasn't before. And so that increases the likelihood that it may not wash out in the future under another extreme event, because floods and droughts are not going anywhere. We're going to continue to have that extreme variability. Instead of just thinking gray infrastructure, looking at green infrastructure. How can we make sure that the environments that surround transportation systems are doing the natural ecosystem services that they've done, that they are absorbing water and creating runoff, and how do we utilize those to their fullest? Because they're very cost efficient and efficient systems to provide that service. So why should we try to rebuild that through gray infrastructure if we can do it with green infrastructure, and then also have other benefits? The other side of this is not just the adaptation side, but the mitigation side and fuel efficient vehicles. How do we expand our electric vehicle infrastructure throughout the state? How do we expand our compressed natural gas? And there are things that you would never even think about. Like, those signs on the side of the highway that tell you where a gas station is? Well, there are regulations that require gas stations to be open 12 hours a day and provide bathrooms. And they have to meet those qualifications to be listed on those blue signs. Well, you don't need that for a compressed natural gas station or an electric charging station. You could just have the station. You don't necessarily need a bathroom. It doesn't need to necessarily be opened, right? Because it's just there. You could just go use it, swipe your credit card, you're done. But it's a national federal regulation for what's on those signs. So how do you make those regulations more flexible to adapt and incorporate that range of new transportation systems? So you have to like totally think about things in a different way. Something that you think is so easy, like you just put a symbol there, a little charge symbol, and you're done, right? Is not actually that easy. And so these are some of the challenges that we've had to deal with. The other thing is public transit. You know, Colorado is a big state. We are a diverse state. It's hard to live in Colorado without a car. I've done it, but I had a really, really small radius because you're not going to ride your bike up to the mountains to go skiing in the winter. And there's not a really great infrastructure to take public transit to get there. And so really improving that public transit. I don't know if any of you guys ridden Bustang, which I will say is like the worst name ever, but so Bustang is a new public transit system that goes from Fort Collins to Denver, Colorado Springs to Denver, and Grand Junction to Denver, and then obviously back, and runs daily. And so folks can use this, and it has been hugely successful. It's not through RTD, it's through CDOT. People love it. I have people in my office in Denver who commute from Fort Collins, and it has transformed their lives because they can have that time to actually like do work on the bus. So things like that, and then obviously big RTD expansions as well. All right, so I am running out of time, and I think I have like 3 more slides. So I'm gonna go through this really, really quickly. Tourism and recreation, I have touched upon kind of throughout this and some of the stressors and vulnerabilities, some of the things to think about. Don't think just about winter tourism and recreation. Also think about summer tourism and recreation. If flows in rivers are melting off and reaching their peak flow a month earlier, so instead of peaking in July, they're peaking in early June, what does that mean for families who are coming out for rafting vacations, but their kids are still in school in June when the rivers are peaking? There's a disconnect, and so there's challenges there. And if rivers are running so low in August that you can't run boats down it, what's the opportunity there? Do you start, is that where you really focus on fishing? Because it's a lot easier to catch fish when there's less water than there is more. But then you also have to deal with higher stream temperatures because less water, higher temperatures gets more concentrated stream temperatures. So there's all these kind of compounding challenges that we're trying to look at and trying to address. At the same time, you don't really want to send the message to folks who want to come spend money in your state, hey, we're really heavily impacted by climate change and it may affect your experience here. So tourism industry is really challenged in that they're trying to make a top-notch experience regardless of what the conditions are and regardless of what's happening. And that's a real challenge. If you notice the ski resorts, a lot of the ski resorts have implemented mountain biking in the summer. Why? Well, because they want to keep revenue up year round. They don't want to be wholly dependent upon one thing. They want that diversity across the board. Rockfalls and avalanches are also a really big concern with climate change as permafrost melts. And so those are some of the things that we need to look at. And then ecosystems. We were just talking about this beforehand when we were talking about, wildfire. And when you have a wildfire, do you revegetate with the plants that were there? Or do you revegetate with the plants that are going to thrive there in 10 to 15 to 20 years? Because a tree lasts a really long time, right? It's going to be here for a lot longer than 10 or 20 years. Hopefully it's going to be here for 200 years. So how do we plant for success going forward? And then some of the drought stress that I've talked about. We also have stresses in habitat for animals. And as we increase our wildland-urban interface, that also becomes more and more of an issue. So how do we manage for that? Ecosystems is really interesting in that, a lot of ecosystem management and parks and wildlife management is things that they've already been doing, but they have to do it kind of more frequently or more intensely than they've done it in the past. But very kind of adaptive, constantly looking at what the situation is and what they're doing. So moving forward, what are we doing at the state level? So now you have this kind of broad overview of what we've been doing, what we've been talking about, and now we're trying to bring all of these pieces together and across all of these sectors that I mentioned, really operationalize climate change. So we want climate change to be one more veil of decision making. So when you are making a decision, you always think about cost, right? Like even in our personal lives, when you make a decision about something, you always think about cost. And then climate change. How is this impacted by climate change? Is it or is it not? If it is there something small change that you can do to either reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, mitigate the future impacts, so moving a road to bedrock, or just kind of adapt your management so that you increase your resiliency? And if so, maybe that 10% extra incremental cost now is going to save you a whole heck of a lot more money down the road. And we should start doing these things now, because it's been estimated to deal with climate change globally is about 1% of GDP globally. That is comparable to what it costs to implement indoor plumbing at the turn of the last century. And I think we would all argue that that was a really good investment. And so it is something that we can deal with and we can move forward with. Sorry, I went over, but.
This is really great, Taryn. I mean, it is a big state, and so there's a lot to talk about. And so you covered a lot of ground for us, so it was really useful. We have time for some questions.
Yeah, so in this state, you know, we have a real kind of stark urban-rural divide, and it sounds like you have some experience working in rural areas, places that are probably the most vulnerable from multiple factors. And I'm guessing, what is your experience in crossing that divide and talking about climate change, and what does the state need from researchers looking at that to better view it well?
Sure. So this may come as a shock, but I've spent a ton of time out with producers in agricultural rural areas of the state, and I have never once had someone fight me on climate change. Now, I will say that I typically don't bring up climate change when talking to them in using the actual phrase climate change. I talk a lot about variability. I talk a lot about droughts and floods. But more often than not, especially now versus 8 years ago when I started doing this, they bring it up to me. And producers on the ground will tell you it's happening. It's different now because many of them have been doing this for 50 years. And they will tell you it is different now than it was 50 years ago. And if this trend continues, regardless of what's causing it, right? Like, let's not argue about causation. It doesn't really matter what's causing the impacts. If you're seeing impacts, then you need to start thinking about how do you change that? How do you influence that? And that's where they're focusing. And especially on the energy efficiency side, the ag producers are psyched to implement energy efficiency on their lands. And so in some of the rural areas, I've gotten less pushback than you would really think. And that's been really eye-opening for me. There's not a ton of resources, right? Like the local communities probably don't have as many resources available as they would in Fort Collins or Boulder or Denver. But certainly the state spends a lot of time trying to help those rural communities. So I think there's a lot of hope and a lot of opportunity. There's more that needs to be done, but I have more hope than perhaps others do.
Looking at the water capacity, of the Arkansas, South Platte, in Arkansas, it was surprising to see how dramatic the water availability was looking into the future, because it was in 98 where we talked to the Northern Colorado Water Board district, and they were saying, no, we had plenty of water. We're not concerned about climate change at all. And so in your recent discussions with them, have they really, what are they seeing as practical, feasible practices that they can use to actually supply the water that the Front Range needs?
So there's no silver bullet. There's no one-shot answer as to what's going to happen. Conservation is a huge piece of it. Doing more with less is certainly a piece. Land use is a piece of it. Storage is a piece of it. We have a situation in the state of Colorado where 80% of our water falls in the west and 80% of our population lives in the east. And so we need to find a way to manage those systems such that we have water available when we need it. And clean, reliable sources of water are really important. So storage is a piece of the puzzle, but again, it's not all of it. And being smarter about kind of how we build those storage systems. Reuse is a part of it. Why are we irrigating our lawns with clean drinking water? Why aren't we using more gray water? Why aren't we using more reuse water? So kind of using the water resources we have more smartly is a really big piece of it. But taking a multifaceted approach, and all the utilities are working on it. I can tell you that Northern, Fort Collins, Boulder, Denver, Aurora, Colorado Springs, all participated in the Front Range Climate Change Vulnerability Study, really looking at climate change and how it impacts their systems. And that was like 6 years ago. So, yeah, Jeff.
Last question.
Okay, wow. Yeah, an honor. Thanks. It was a good presentation. Great to see. One question I've heard is kind of like light rail across 25, and a new, I think, comes from the governor's office to expand 25, or at least the state, which seems to me the exact wrong thing to do. When you look at, to me, kind of the tale of maybe 4 cities of Albuquerque and Santa Fe that has a light rail, almost identical populations, and Colorado and Fort Collins, or Denver and Fort Collins. So where people say that that's impossible, it's going to take too much to pay for it. When you see something in New Mexico that's existing, where does Colorado stand on that? And it doesn't seem to be debated much, or I don't see a lot on it.
So it's a challenge, and the challenge is that our society hasn't quite, we're a society that's built on highways, not railways, right? Like that's what we've become accustomed to. We embrace the American mentality of being able to get in your car and get anywhere, and that open road. That's very different than what we've seen in like Europe, where they were building rail systems before the rise of the automobile, and so they have much more extensive rail systems that people are accustomed to using. And so there's a period of time in which you have to kind of build for the future, but also like bring along society. And so people need to understand that there's some give and take, right? So if you build public transit and light rail and it takes twice as long to get from point A to point B as when you drive, and it's more expensive, people aren't going to do it, right? But if you have a system where it's taking, 10 minutes longer, but then it's actually more convenient because you don't have to pay for parking, you get to walk, you get, something like that, then people understand and see the benefit of it. And I think as a society, we're in this kind of period where we're starting to embrace that and we're starting to want that. But because the infrastructure isn't there enough yet, we also still want those roads and the traditional sources. And so I think it's an evolution, and we're definitely talking about that, and we're trying to expand those systems. I would just say our transit system has like an $80 billion deficit just within the state of Colorado. And that's not even looking at federal highways, that's just state road systems. And so how do we fund these infrastructure needs to keep things safe, but also to expand opportunities in transit?
Well, thanks. I'm sure Taryn will be able to stick around and answer some questions afterwards, but let's thank Taryn for her presentation. And a reminder, next week we have Marion Moore from Oklahoma, a climate scientist of high renown. Will be here next Friday. Thanks.
Thanks. Hopefully that was